I knew I had lost my husband, but I didn't expect to lose my place in my own life before they even closed his casket. The morning air was cold enough to bite through my black wool coat as I stepped out of the car, the kind of sharp November chill that settles into your bones and lingers. And for a moment, I stood there looking at the white lilies arranged along the entrance of the funeral home, trying to steady my breathing, trying to prepare myself to say goodbye to Thomas after 42 years of marriage. But before I could even take a full step forward, she appeared, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. Vanessa Cole, tall, composed, wearing a sleek black dress that fit her like she belonged at the center of this tragedy, not at its edges, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she approached me with a calm that felt rehearsed. And then, without warning, without hesitation, she leaned in just enough for no one else to notice the exact motion and spat onto the front of my coat. A small, deliberate act that felt louder than any scream before straightening up and looking at me with a faint smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and saying in a low, measured voice, "He left you penniless," as if she were simply stating a fact, as if she had already accepted it as truth. And behind her, just a few steps back, stood Gregory Shaw, my husband's attorney for over a decade, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression almost polite, but there it was unmistakable, the slight curve at the corner of his mouth, a smirk he didn't bother to hide. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't cruelty born out of grief or chaos. This was something planned, something structured, something they both believed was already finished. And I felt the eyes of a few nearby guests flicker toward us, and then quickly away, choosing silence over involvement, choosing comfort over truth. And I could have reacted, I could have raised my voice or stepped back or demanded an explanation. But instead I reached into my purse, pulled out a handkerchief, and pressed it gently against the damp spot on my coat, my fingers steady even as the air seemed to tighten around me. And I said nothing, not because I didn't understand what had just happened, but because I understood it too well, because whatever game they thought they had already won had started long before this morning. And I had just walked into the final act without knowing the script. And as I lifted my chin and walked past them toward the doors, I caught my reflection briefly in the glass. A woman dressed in mourning, composed, silent, and entirely underestimated. And for the first time since Thomas had passed, I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, not anger, but awareness, sharp and clear, the kind that tells you the story you've been living is not the one that's being told around you. And as the doors opened and the scent of flowers and polish would fill the air, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. They thought I was the widow, but I was the only one who had been paying attention. Inside the funeral home, everything was arranged with a kind of careful elegance that made the moment feel almost unreal, as if grief had been polished and set on display for others to observe from a distance. The soft glow of warm lights reflecting off the dark wood floors, the scent of lilies and roses hanging heavy in the air, and rows of chairs filled with people dressed in black who spoke in hushed voices, their words blending into a low, constant murmur that never quite reached clarity. And I walked slowly down the aisle toward the front where Thomas lay, each step measured, deliberate, because I could feel it now, the subtle shift in the room, the way conversations paused just slightly as I passed, the way eyes followed me, but never held my gaze for more than a second. And it was not sympathy I felt from them, not the quiet support one might expect for a woman who had just lost her husband, but something else, something more distant, almost cautious, as if I had already been moved to the edges of a story that no longer belonged to me. And when I reached the front and stood beside the casket, I let my hand rest lightly on the polished surface, grounding myself in something solid, something real, because everything else felt like it was shifting beneath me. And for a moment I allowed myself to look at him, to take in the stillness of his face, the man I had shared more than 4 decades with, the man who used to reach for my hand without thinking, who used to fill our home with a quiet, steady presence. And I searched for some trace of that familiarity now, some reassurance that the life we had built together had not simply dissolved into this strange, carefully managed performance. But all I found was silence. And behind me, I could hear the faint, confident tone of Vanessa's voice as she spoke to a group of guests, thanking them for coming, accepting condolences as if they were meant for her, and there was a smoothness to the way she carried herself, a certainty that did not belong to someone standing on the outside. And when I turned slightly, just enough to see without making it obvious, I noticed how people responded to her, how they nodded, how they listened, how they accepted her presence without question. And Gregory stood nearby, speaking quietly. With a man I recognized from Thomas's business circle, his posture relaxed, his expression composed, and every now and then his eyes would flicker in my direction, not with concern, not even with curiosity, but with the calm assurance of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. And that was when the realization settled more deeply into me, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable truth, that whatever had been set in motion had been done with precision, that the roles had been assigned before I ever stepped through those doors, and I was expected to play mine without question, to stand quietly, to accept what was being implied without being told directly, and I felt the weight of that expectation press against me, not as something overwhelming, but as something clarifying, because it stripped away any illusion I might have still been holding on to, and in its place left something sharper, something more focused. And as I straightened my shoulders and let my hand fall from the casket, I understood that the silence in the room was not just about mourning. It was about control, about who held it and who had lost it. And they believed I'd already lost mine. They believed that the woman who stood there in black, with silver hair and steady hands, was simply waiting to be told what remained of her life. But as I turned and took my seat in the front row, folding my hands neatly in my lap, I made a quiet decision that I did not share with anyone, not with the guests who avoided my eyes, not with the woman who spoke as if she owned the room, and certainly not with the lawyer who watched everything with that faint, knowing smile. I decided that before I accepted anything, before I allowed their version of the truth to settle into place, I would find out exactly what had been taken from me, and more importantly, how they thought they had managed to do it without me noticing. After the service ended, people began to drift toward the reception hall in slow, careful movements, as if no one wanted to be the first to return to normal conversation, and I followed at a distance, watching rather than participating, because something in me had already shifted from grieving to observing, and the room they had prepared was bright in a way that felt almost inappropriate, sunlight filtering through tall windows, reflecting off glass pitchers and neatly arranged trays of food, creating an atmosphere that was closer to a quiet gathering than a farewell. I noticed immediately how Vanessa positioned herself near the center of it all, greeting guests before they could reach anyone else, placing a hand lightly on an arm here, offering a soft smile there, speaking in a tone that suggested familiarity, even authority, and people responded to her as if it made sense, as if her presence required no explanation, and I stood near the edge of the room for a moment, taking it in until I saw something that made me pause, something small but unmistakable, a gold cufflink on her wrist, subtle, almost hidden beneath the sleeve of her dress. But I recognized it instantly because I had given that exact pair to Thomas on our 25th anniversary, a custom engraving on the inside that only I knew about, and for a second the room seemed to narrow, the sound fading just enough for that detail to stand out with painful clarity, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the strap of my purse, not out of shock, but out of confirmation, because that was not an item that could have been casually borrowed or forgotten. It was something personal, something that should never have left our home without intention. And yet there it was, resting casually against her skin as if it had always belonged to her. I did not confront her. I did not even let my gaze linger long enough to draw attention, but I shifted my focus instead to Gregory, who was now speaking with two men from Thomas's former firm, his posture relaxed, his voice low and measured. And as I moved closer under the pretense of reaching for a glass of water, I caught a fragment of his conversation, just enough to understand the tone. "Everything has already been finalized," he said, with a certainty that carried more weight than the words themselves. And one of the men nodded slowly, as if reassured by that statement, as if whatever had been finalized was both expected and acceptable, and Gregory's eyes lifted briefly, meeting mine for just a fraction of a second before he looked away, But in that moment I saw it clearly, not hostility, not even dismissal, but confidence, the kind that comes from believing there are no loose ends left to tie. And I stepped back then, allowing the flow of people to move between us. And I realized that what I had witnessed was not a collection of coincidences, not a series of unfortunate misunderstandings, but a pattern, one that had been forming quietly, deliberately, over time. And as I moved toward a quieter corner of the room, I let my mind begin to trace it backward, not in a rush, not with panic, but carefully, piece by piece, because if they believed everything had already been settled, then they had made one critical assumption, that I would accept their version of events without question, that I would remain exactly what they saw when they looked at me, a grieving widow, displaced and unaware. And I understood now that the truth was not going to be handed to me in a conversation or revealed in a single document. It was something I would have to uncover myself, quietly, methodically, without giving them any reason to suspect that I was doing anything other than what they expected. And as I set my untouched glass back on the table and straightened my coat, the faint mark from earlier now barely visible, I felt that same clarity return, sharper this time, steadier, because I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was beginning to understand it. And once you understand something, truly understand it, you are no longer at its mercy. Later that afternoon, after the last guest had left and the carefully arranged chairs had been folded away, I returned to the house that Thomas and I had built together more than 3 decades ago. And for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to move through it slowly, not as someone lost in grief, but as someone searching for answers, because every room held a version of the life we had shared, and I needed to understand where that life had begun to change. And when I stepped into the living room, the late sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor in long, quiet lines, just as it always had, illuminating the same furniture we had chosen together, the same photographs lining the shelves, but something about it felt different now. Not because the house had changed, but because I was seeing it without the comfort of assumption, without the belief that everything within these walls had been as it seemed. And I moved toward Thomas's study, a room he had always kept in careful order, a space that had once felt like a reflection of his discipline, his structure, his sense of responsibility. And I paused at the doorway for a moment, remembering how many evenings he had spent there in the past year, longer than usual, often closing the door when he had never done so before, telling me he needed to review documents or handle business matters that could not wait. And at the time I had accepted those explanations without question, trusting the man I had known for most of my life, trusting that whatever distance I felt was temporary, something that would pass once whatever pressure he was under had eased. But now, standing in that doorway, I could see those moments differently, not as isolated changes, but as part of a pattern I had chosen not to examine too closely, and I stepped inside, letting my fingers brush lightly against the edge of his desk. The surface still as orderly as he had left it, papers stacked neatly, a pen aligned perfectly beside a closed leather folder, everything in its place, everything suggesting control. And yet there was an absence beneath that order, something missing that I could not immediately name. And I opened the top drawer slowly, expecting to find the familiar collection of documents he had always kept there, financial records, correspondence, notes written in his precise handwriting. But instead I found it nearly empty, the space too clean, too deliberate, as if it had been cleared with intention rather than neglect. And I stood there for a moment, letting that realization settle, because Thomas had never been careless with his records. He had believed in keeping everything, in maintaining a clear trail of decisions and responsibilities, and for those documents to be gone meant that someone had removed them, not in a hurry, but with purpose. And I closed the drawer gently and turned toward the bookshelf, scanning the rows of binders and folders that lined it, noticing small gaps where certain items should have been, gaps that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not lived in this house for years, who had not watched Thomas organize and reorganize these shelves with quiet precision. And as I traced those gaps with my eyes, I felt that same clarity return, stronger now, more grounded, because this was no longer about suspicion or instinct. It was about evidence, about the physical absence of things that should have been there. And I thought back to the past 6 months, To the evenings when Thomas had stayed in this room longer than usual, to the way he had grown more guarded, more careful with his words, to the occasional tension in his voice when Gregory's name had come up in conversation, a tension I had noticed but not pursued, choosing instead to believe that it was simply the strain of business. And I remembered one night in particular, when Thomas had come into the kitchen later than usual, his expression distant, his movements slower, and when I had asked if everything was all right, he had hesitated just for a second before, saying that he was making some changes to ensure that things would be handled properly in the future, that he wanted to make sure I would be taken care of no matter what happened. And at the time I had smiled, reassured by the sentiment, comforted by the idea that he was thinking ahead, but now, standing in the quiet of his study, with empty drawers and missing files around me. Those words carried a different weight, a different meaning, because they suggested that he had been aware of something, that he had been trying to address it, perhaps even correct it, and that whatever steps he had taken had not been completed in the way he intended. And I walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where we had spent so many summers together, the familiar sight grounding me as I considered what I had seen, what I had begun to understand. And I realized that the story being presented to me, the one Vanessa and Gregory seemed so confident in, depended on one critical assumption, that Thomas had made his final decisions willingly and without interference, that everything had been settled according to his intentions. But the empty spaces in this room told a different story, one that had not yet been fully revealed. And as I turned back toward the desk, placing my hand once more on its smooth surface, I understood that whatever had happened here had not been finished, and that meant there was still something left to find, something they had either overlooked or believed no one would ever look for. And I knew then that I would not stop until I found it. The next morning, I did not allow myself the luxury of hesitation, because once you see that something is wrong, truly wrong, waiting only give the other side more time to reinforce whatever they have already built. So I returned to Thomas's study with a quiet sense of purpose, the kind that does not rush but does not stop either. And I began again, not looking for what should have been there, but for what might have been left behind unintentionally, something small, something overlooked. Because no matter how carefully a plan is executed, there's always something that does not fit perfectly, and I started with the bookshelf, running my fingers lightly along the edges of the binders, noticing the slight differences in dust patterns, the faint outlines where items had once rested, and then I moved lower to the cabinet beneath, where Thomas kept older files that he rarely needed but never discarded. And as I opened it, the familiar scent of paper and time greeted me, a reminder that this was where he kept records. He did not want disturbed, and I knelt down, scanning the rows, until I found a thin folder tucked slightly behind the others, its edge just visible, as if it had been pushed back in a hurry or perhaps hidden without full attention. And I pulled it out slowly, my hand steady, my breath even, and when I opened it, I found a series of documents that immediately felt different from the rest. Not because of their content at first glance, but because of their dates. They were recent, far more. Recent than anything else in this cabinet. And as I turned the pages carefully, I began to see what made them stand out. There were annotations in Thomas's handwriting, small notes in the margins, underlined phrases, and once or twice, a word circled with more force than the others, as if he had been trying to draw his own attention back to it. And the documents themselves referenced revisions, changes to asset allocations, updates that had not been finalized, but had clearly been in progress. And I felt a quiet confirmation settle over me, because this aligned with what I had begun to suspect, that Thomas had not been finished, that whatever arrangements Gregory now claimed were complete had been altered, or at the very least questioned, in the final weeks of his life. And I continued reading, more carefully now, until I reached a page that caused me to pause, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple, a short note, written in Thomas's precise script, attached to a draft of what appeared to be an amended directive, and the note read, "Review with independent counsel before signing," and below that a date, just 10 days before he passed, and I sat back slightly, letting that sink in, because it changed everything. It meant that Thomas had not fully trusted the process he was currently involved in, that he had intended to seek a second opinion. to verify or possibly challenge whatever had been presented to him, and that step had never been completed, or if it had not been reflected in the version Gregory now stood behind with such confidence. And I closed the folder gently, holding it in my lap for a moment as I considered what this meant, because this was no longer about missing documents or subtle inconsistencies. This was about intention, about a decision that had been interrupted, and I thought back to the way Gregory had spoken at the reception, the certainty in his voice, the implication that everything had been finalized, and I realized that his confidence depended on one thing, that no one would question whether Thomas had been in full agreement with the final version of events, that no one would look for evidence that he had hesitated, that he had intended to take a different path. And I stood up slowly, placing the folder back where I had found it. Not because I was finished with it, but because I understood the importance of not disturbing the pattern too soon, of not revealing that I had already begun to see what they believed was hidden. And as I closed the cabinet and straightened, I felt that same calm resolve settle in a place, stronger now, more defined, because I was no longer searching blindly. I had found something real, something that suggested there was a version of the truth that had not yet been told. And as I left the study, turning off the light behind me, I understood that whatever they had constructed was not as complete as they believed, and that meant there was still time to unravel it, carefully, quietly, and entirely on my terms. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I left the house without telling anyone where I was going, not out of secrecy, but out of necessity, because the moment you begin to question something that others believe is already settled, you learn very quickly that silence becomes your most valuable advantage. And I drove across town to the small branch of the bank Thomas had used for decades, a place where routines mattered and records were kept with a kind of quiet diligence that larger institutions often overlooked. And as I walked through the glass doors, I felt the familiar cool air settle around me, the faint scent of polished counters and paper reminding me of all the times Thomas and I had stood there together discussing mortgages, investments, plans for the future that had once felt certain and shared, and I approached the front desk with the same calm composure I had maintained since the funeral, requesting access to our joint account records, my voice steady, my expression neutral, because there was no reason yet to reveal anything beyond what was expected of a widow organizing her affairs. And the young woman behind the desk nodded politely, typing a few details into her computer before directing me to a private office where a manager could assist me further. And as I waited, I let my gaze drift across the framed certificates on the wall, each one representing years of trust and accountability, values that now felt more relevant than ever. And when the manager entered, a man in his late 50s with a measured tone and careful manner, he greeted me with quiet sympathy before sitting down across from me, asking how he could help, and I explained that I needed a full review of recent transactions, particularly those from the past 6 months, framing it as a matter of organization, of wanting to ensure everything was in order, and he nodded again, understanding the request without probing further. And as he began to pull up the records, the soft clicking of his keyboard filled the room, a steady rhythm that seemed to mirror the clarity forming in my own mind. And when he turned the screen slightly toward me, I leaned in just enough to see, scanning the entries with focused attention, not rushing, not reacting outwardly, but noting each detail as it appeared, the dates, the amounts, the destinations of transfers that had not been part of our usual pattern. And it did not take long to find the first inconsistency, a series of payments directed toward an account I did not recognize, spaced out over several weeks, each one small enough to avoid immediate concern, but together forming a sum that was far from insignificant. And I asked about it in a quiet tone, as if it were simply a point of clarification, and the manager reviewed the information briefly before explaining that the transfers had been authorized through proper channels, accompanied by documentation that appeared to be in order, and I nodded, as if satisfied with that explanation, but I asked to see the authorization records themselves, the signatures, the timestamps, anything that would confirm the process, and after a brief pause, he agreed, pulling up the digital copies that had been filed, and as I examined them, I felt that same sense of recognition return, not shock, Not disbelief, but confirmation, because while the signature bore Thomas's name, there was something subtly different about it, a slight hesitation in the curve of one letter, a spacing that did not quite align with the way he had always written, details that would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent years watching him sign documents at our kitchen table. I did not point it out, not yet. Instead, I simply asked for printed copies of the records, explaining that I preferred to review them more carefully at home, and the manager obliged without hesitation, gathering the documents and placing them neatly into a folder before handing it to me with a polite nod. And I thanked him, rising from my seat with the same composed demeanor I had carried in. But as I stepped back out into the afternoon light, the folder held firmly in my hands, I understood that what I had found was not just a discrepancy. It was a pattern, one that extended beyond missing files and unfinished notes, one that suggested deliberate action taken under the assumption that no one would look closely enough to question it. And as I walked to my car and placed the folder on the passenger seat beside me, I allowed myself a single, quiet breath, not of relief, but of certainty, because the pieces were beginning to align, and the picture they formed was no longer one of confusion, but of intent. And once intent is clear, the next step is not to confront it immediately, but to let it reveal itself completely on its own, until there is nothing left for it to hide behind. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of me, the overhead light casting a steady glow across the pages as I spread them out one by one, not rushing, not skipping ahead, but reading each line with the same quiet attention I had given to everything since the funeral, because I understood now that the truth was not hidden in grand gestures or obvious mistakes. It was buried in small inconsistencies, in details that only mattered if you knew what they were supposed to look like. And as I traced my finger along the printed signatures, comparing them to older documents I had retrieved from the filing cabinet in the hallway, I could see it more clearly with each comparison, the slight variation in pressure, the difference in spacing, the subtle hesitation in strokes that had once been fluid and confident. And I remembered how Thomas used to sign his name at the end of letters, at the bottom of checks, always the same, always precise, as if it were a reflection of the way he approached everything in his life. And these signatures did not carry that same certainty. They carried something else, something practiced, something close, but not exact. And I leaned back in my chair, letting the papers rest in front of me as I considered what that meant. Because this was no longer about suspicion or instinct. It was evidence, quiet but undeniable. And I thought again about the note I'd found in his study, the one that mentioned independent counsel, the intention to verify before signing. And I realized that whatever had happened in those final days had interrupted that process. That the version of events Gregory now presented as complete may have been built on something unfinished, something that had not received the confirmation Thomas had intended. And I reached for my phone then, not to call Gregory, not to confront Vanessa, but to search for a name that had not been part of our conversations for years. Daniel Brooks, an attorney Thomas had once mentioned in passing, someone he respected for his independence, for his unwillingness to accept things at face value. And I found the number after a few minutes, stored in an old contact list I had nearly forgotten existed. And I hesitated only briefly before dialing, listening to the soft ring as it connected. And when a calm, steady voice answered, I introduced myself without elaboration, explaining only that I was calling regarding a matter Thomas had intended to discuss but had not been able to complete. And there was a pause on the other end, not of confusion but of recognition, as if the name alone was enough to place the context. And Daniel asked if I would be willing to meet in person, suggesting his office the following morning, and I agreed without hesitation because I understood the importance of moving carefully but also moving forward. And after the call ended, I sat there for a moment longer, the silence of the house settling around me. But it no longer felt empty in the same way it had before. It felt focused, purposeful, as if every room now held a question waiting to be answered, and I gathered the documents back into the folder, aligning them neatly, because even in uncertainty there is value in order. And as I stood and turned off the light, leaving the kitchen in darkness, I felt that same steady clarity guiding me, not driven by anger, not fueled by grief, but anchored in something far more reliable. The simple understanding that whatever had been taken or altered had not been done without leaving a trace, and I intended to follow that trace wherever it led, quietly, patiently, until there was nothing left for anyone to deny. The next morning, I arrived at Daniel Brooks's office 10 minutes early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit, because Thomas had always believed that time revealed character, and I had carried that belief with me for years. And as I sat in the quiet reception area, I took in the details around me, the muted tones of the walls, the neatly arranged legal texts on a low shelf, the absence of anything excessive or distracting. Everything about the space suggested clarity, restraint, and a focus on substance over appearance. And when Daniel stepped out to greet me, he carried that same presence, composed, observant, the kind of man who listened before he spoke. And as we walked into his office, I placed a folder on his desk without ceremony, opening it to the documents I had brought, and I explained everything in a steady, measured tone, not dramatizing, not speculating, simply laying out the facts as I'd found them, the missing files, the note in Thomas's handwriting, the transfers, the signatures that did not quite align. And Daniel listened without interruption, his attention fixed on the pages as he reviewed them carefully, occasionally pausing to examine a detail more closely, and the silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate, a space where information could settle before conclusions were drawn, and after several minutes, he leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, and spoke in a calm, precise voice, saying that what I had found was significant, not because it proved everything outright, but because it introduced doubt where certainty had been presented, and in legal matters, doubt is often the first step toward unraveling something that has been constructed too confidently. And he pointed to the note Thomas had written, emphasizing the importance of that single line, the intention to consult independent counsel, because it indicated that Thomas had not finalized his decisions, that he had recognized the need for verification, and that process had been interrupted. And Daniel explained that if a final document had been executed without that step, particularly under circumstances where the original intent suggested otherwise, it could be challenged, not through confrontation alone, but through careful examination of procedure, timing, and consistency. And I listened, absorbing each word without reacting outwardly, because this was not about validation, it was about direction. And when he turned his attention to the bank records, he noted the pattern of transfers, the incremental nature of them, the way they avoided immediate detection while accumulating into something far more substantial. And he pointed out that the authorization documents, while appearing complete on the surface, would require closer scrutiny, particularly if there were discrepancies in signatures or irregularities in the timeline. And I nodded, understanding that what I had brought him was not yet a conclusion, but it was enough to begin. And Daniel closed the folder gently, resting his hand on top of it as he looked at me with a quiet seriousness. And he said that if I chose to move forward, it would require patience, precision, and restraint that it would not be resolved in a single moment or a dramatic confrontation, but through a series of deliberate steps that would allow the truth to surface on its own terms. And I understood that immediately, because it aligned with everything I had already begun to do. And when he asked if there was an upcoming event where all relevant parties would be present, I thought of the scheduled reading of the will, a formal gathering where Gregory would present what he believed to be the final version of Thomas's decisions, and I told him the date and time. And Daniel nodded once, as if confirming something in his own mind, and he said that it would be the appropriate place to begin, not to interrupt, not to accuse, but to observe, to allow the process to unfold exactly as intended, and then at the right moment, to introduce what had been overlooked. And as I left his office with the folder once again in my hands, I felt no sense of urgency, no need to rush ahead of what was already in motion. Because for the first time since the funeral, I understood the structure of what I was facing, not as something overwhelming, but as something that could be taken apart piece by piece. And as I stepped outside into the clear morning light, I knew that whatever they believed had been settled was about to be tested in a way they had not anticipated, not through force, not through emotion, but through the simple act of paying attention where they had assumed no one would. The day of the will reading arrived with a quiet clarity that felt almost deceptive. The sky clear, the air still, as if nothing significant was about to take place, and I dressed with the same care I had given every step since the funeral, choosing a simple black suit, understated, composed, the same coat draped over my shoulders, the faint mark long since gone, but not forgotten. And when I entered the conference room at Gregory Shaw's office, I did so without hesitation, without pause. Because by then, I understood that presence alone could shift the balance of a room, if carried correctly, and the space itself was exactly what one would expect: polished wood table, leather chairs arranged with precision, a pitcher of water set neatly at the center. Everything designed to suggest order, authority, finality. And Vanessa was already there, seated near the head of the table, her posture relaxed, her expression confident in a way that no longer surprised me. And Gregory stood beside her, reviewing a set of documents with the same composed assurance he had carried since the beginning. And when his eyes lifted to meet mine, there was a flicker of recognition, followed by that familiar, controlled smile, the kind that assumed understanding without needing confirmation, and I took my seat without a word, placing my hands lightly on the table, allowing the silence to settle into place before anything began, because silence, I had learned, was not emptiness, it was space. Space for others to reveal themselves. And as the remaining attendees filtered in, a few distant relatives, a representative from Thomas's business, and finally Daniel, who entered quietly and took a seat at the far end without drawing attention to himself. The arrangement completed itself without discussion, each person falling into their expected role. And Gregory cleared his throat, beginning the proceedings with a tone that carried practiced authority, outlining the purpose of the meeting, the importance of the document he was about to present, the care with which it had been prepared, and I listened without interruption, without reaction, because I recognized now that his confidence depended on momentum, on moving forward without pause, without question. And when he began to read, detailing the distribution of assets, the allocation of properties, the decisions that had supposedly been finalized, I allowed each word to pass without resistance. Not because I accepted them, but because I understood that the moment to respond had not yet arrived, and I could feel Vanessa's attention shift toward me more than once, waiting perhaps for a reaction, for a sign of distress or disbelief, something that would confirm the version of events she had already embraced. But I gave her nothing, only stillness, only the quiet presence of someone who was listening more closely than expected. And Gregory reached the final pages, the sections that carried the greatest weight, the conclusions he believed would settle everything. And there was a slight shift in his tone, a subtle emphasis that suggested closure. And that was when Daniel moved, not abruptly, not disruptively, but with a calm precision that drew attention without demanding it. His voice steady as he asked a single question, not accusatory, not confrontational, but clear, requesting clarification on the timeline of the document's execution in relation to any pending revisions. And the room changed in that moment. Not dramatically, not outwardly, but in a way that could be felt beneath the surface, like a structure encountering resistance for the first time. And Gregory paused, just briefly, before responding, maintaining his composure as he reiterated the completeness of the document. But Daniel continued, referencing the note, the intention for independent review, the absence of confirmation that such a step had been completed, and he placed the copies of the records on the table with deliberate care, not as an accusation, but as an addition, something that required acknowledgement. And I watched as Gregory's expression adjusted, not collapsing, not losing control, but tightening, recalibrating in real time as he recognized that the certainty he had relied on was no longer unchallenged, and Vanessa's confidence shifted as well, not disappearing, but faltering just enough to reveal that this was not the script she had expected to follow. And I did not speak immediately because the truth, once introduced, does not need to be forced, it expands on its own. And when I finally did, My voice was calm, measured, carrying no trace of anger, only clarity, and I said that I had come to understand something in the days since Thomas passed, that silence can be mistaken for agreement, but it can also be a form of observation, and I looked directly at Gregory, then at Vanessa, and I said, "You believed everything had already been decided, but what you relied on was never finished," and I let the words settle, not adding anything more, because there was nothing more needed. The documents were there, the questions had been raised, the certainty had been interrupted, and as I stood, gathering my things with the same steady movements I had carried from the beginning, I understood that this was not the end of what had been set in motion, but it was the moment where control had shifted, quietly, definitively, away from those who had assumed it was theirs. And as I walked toward the door, I did not look back because I no longer needed to see their reactions to know what had changed. At a quiet funeral that should have honored a lifetime of marriage, an elderly widow is publicly humiliated by the mistress while a confident lawyer watches with unsettling certainty, setting the stage for a gripping unraveling of truth, deception, and control. As the elderly widow begins to notice subtle inconsistencies in financial records, missing documents, and unfinished intentions left behind by her late husband, she quietly shifts from a grieving figure into a calculated observer, revealing how power in family stories is often taken in silence rather than force. Through careful investigation, she uncovers a pattern of manipulation involving the mistress and the lawyer, exposing how assumptions about vulnerability can be exploited in family stories where trust has been quietly eroded. With the help of an independent attorney, the elderly widow pieces together overlooked evidence and challenges the narrative presented to her, demonstrating how patience and awareness can redefine outcomes in family stories that seem already decided. At a formal reading, what was expected to be a final confirmation turns into a subtle but decisive shift in control as hidden doubts surface and the carefully constructed confidence of the mistress and the lawyer begins to falter, proving that in family stories, certainty without truth cannot withstand scrutiny. This emotional and layered narrative explores betrayal, dignity, and quiet resilience, showing how a woman underestimated by those around her reclaims her position not through confrontation, but through clarity, making this one of the most compelling family stories about power, perception, and the strength found in silence. Character 1. A 68-year-old white American woman with silver hair styled neatly, wearing an elegant black wool coat and formal funeral attire. Front-facing portrait with calm, composed expression. Realistic lighting. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI, no illustration. Character 2. A 35-year-old white American woman with blonde hair and sharp, confident features, wearing a fitted black dress, elegant and front-facing portrait with subtle smirk and piercing gaze. Realistic lighting. No cartoon, no cartoon. No CGI, no illustration.